We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donation, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel, a podcast about all things rock art. Send us your suggestions.
Welcome to the 21st episode of your Rock Art Podcast. My name's Alan Garfinkel, and today we're going to be interviewing Gene Meieran, who's one of the key authors of a remarkable basketry book about the imagery and wonder and excellence of masterpiece California Indian baskets. Well, hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel. We are absolutely blessed and honored to have a colleague, an associate who I have known for about 7 or even a little bit longer than that. His name is Gene Meieran, and Gene is being recorded from up in the northwestern portion of our great United States, is it Oregon, Gene?
Oregon.
Yeah. And Gene is the author, one of 2 authors, of an upcoming brand new volume on the remarkable California Indian baskets that were fashioned during what they call the fluorescence. This was a period of wonderful, unique, and tremendously interesting and aesthetically beautiful basketry. And one might ask, why are we interviewing Gene Meieran about his basketry book on a rock art podcast? Well, surprisingly enough, the iconography, meaning the symbols and designs that appear on these baskets, have similarities to rock art images and are revealing in some ways of the cosmology, the religious metaphors for Native people throughout California. Now, Gene is an interesting soul. He hails from the high technology arena and has been in that field for much of his adult life. And yet he twinned with a gentleman named Wayne Thompson. Do I have that right?
Yes.
And Wayne and he approached me to help them with this book. I believe it was 6 or 7 years ago. And it's going to be coming out no later than mid-December. And it's a remarkable, unbelievable volume. Am I able to state the investment that went into this, Gene, or is that persona non grata?
Well, I could say it's the equivalent of a medium-sized house.
Anyways, this is one of the most expensive books that have probably been developed. It was an investment of $250,000 in about a decade of time to really showcase the remarkable masterpiece California Indian baskets. These are some of the most beautiful and valuable baskets, I would say, in the world. Gene, why don't you kick it off a little bit and talk about this odyssey that began a decade ago, and how in the world did you get involved with this crazy project?
Well, the Odyssey actually began roughly 75 years ago, Alan. I was started collecting rocks and crystals when I was a kid. So 7 or 8 years old, I was going out and hunting rocks and crystals, which became a passion for me. So I ended up studying the properties of minerals and properties of crystals professionally. And I kept on rock collecting and collecting crystals and working with museums and doing a lot of stuff in the field of mineral collecting for the next, 70 years, starting in 1948. A long time. And I did. I started in Cleveland, Ohio, which is not exactly a mecca for collecting minerals. All you can get there is sandstone and shale. So it was an interesting time. But anyway, I kept on collecting and building a collection. I went into the field of material science, and I joined the semiconductor industry in its infancy back in the 1960s after I graduated from MIT, and started working in the semiconductor industry. But I kept on collecting crystals. And one day in Phoenix at the big mineral show down in Tucson, Arizona, I met this guy who was hippie looking, and I thought nothing of him in the sense that, I had been collecting for longer than he was alive. He kept telling me about all these wonderful specimens in the cases. And I kept saying, this is absurd. What does he know? Then moved to Tucson, to Phoenix after a while from the Bay Area where I was stationed with Intel. And then met Wayne professionally, and all the collectors in the area where when we first met in Phoenix was, there's Wayne Thompson. And it was like a rock star. Everyone was pointing him because it turns out he had self-collected many of the most beautiful mineral specimens in many of the museums around the world. And it turned out he knew an awful lot about the minerals and the collecting and the mines and the ore bodies and the geology, which is much more than I knew because I knew about the structure and the characteristics and the X-ray diffraction patterns and all that sort of thing. So we kind of got together, and then we found out we both had a mutual interest in ceramic art from the Pueblos in Arizona. My wife was a ceramic artist. We were collecting ceramic art at the same time, and his wife also did ceramic art, and they had a collection of Pueblo pottery. And so we just got together. And then his wife became fairly ill with cancer. She eventually passed away from this. And Wayne turned his attention away from the pottery and the minerals because the baskets started fascinating him. The Indian baskets from the areas, some of which were similar to the Pueblos, like the Apaches, the Navajo, were not Pueblo Indians, but the Apaches were near the Navajo and the Hopi. He started getting interested in the patterns of the basketry and especially in the art of the basketry because he noticed that while it was easy to create a beautiful ceramic pot in the space of days, weeks, or months, some of these baskets took years to put together, and he became fascinated with them. Now, I had a lot of computer background experience, and Wayne had none, so it sort of was a marriage made together where he knew a lot about the origins of the baskets, the tribes, the weavers, the history, the archaeology, the anthropology, and I knew a lot about the images and the museums and the sources of the collecting. So we decided to get together and we went and did a book. Just want to mention that the first intent of the book was to talk about really the baskets, how beautiful they were, the geometric patterns that you mentioned, Alan.
Yes.
And all that stuff. But then as we got into it, the book became much more textured towards the weavers themselves, these women that lived in the age between 1895 and 1940, this time period called the Fluorescence, which is a peculiar time period because what happened was people were making baskets all the time, but when the railroad came and aluminum metals came available, the idea of making baskets for utilitarian use dropped off because you could then buy aluminum baskets and the trains were bringing in the tourists, so the tourists wanted the ideas of making baskets for tourists, for the trade, and you didn't need to make the utilitarian baskets, so they created these absolutely marvelous things that are called masterpieces.
Absolutely.
Wayne had written a book about masterpiece mineral specimens, the best mineral specimens in the world, which he called icons, and he spelled icons with a K because Wayne happens to be sort of independent thinking. And so he decided that this book would be Icons of the Fluorescence or California Masterpiece Baskets. And that's what we put together.
So now Wayne Thompson, I've had the pleasure of meeting him a couple times, and I've spoken to you, Gene, much longer. And just so the audience knows this, I am identified as the editor of this interesting volume and remarkable expression. Wayne is in part a collector of native baskets, and he acquired some of the most remarkable examples that exist in the world. Am I correct, Gene?
Yes. One of Wayne's talents is that he only goes for the best of the best of the best. To him, almost everything is not quite rubble, but, sort of secondary of importance, except for the very finest of whatever species it is. So he sort of specialized in collecting the best mineral specimens. If it was azurite, these were the best azurites in the world. If they were wolfenites, they were the best wolfenites in the world. So when he started on the baskets, he only wanted to do things about the best of the masterpiece baskets.
Yes, I got it. And he does own and has acquired some of the most extraordinary and unique and the masterpiece examples of California Indian basketry that exist in the world. Now, I guess fast forward to this idea of putting a book together. Who had the idea?
Wayne had the idea. His wife was, as I said, was sick with cancer in the hospital.
Yes.
And he was just staying there. So he was just getting books, all the books on the old art. Luckily, fortunately, there were many books written by people from the Smithsonian, from other museums about basketry. So he just accumulated these books, and he has a phenomenal memory. So he just went through the books and assimilated everything in them, but then had a trouble of trying to put these ideas together since he was not particularly good with computers. And that's what I offered to help him. So this occurred about 8 years ago when his wife was in the hospital. Unfortunate circumstances that led to the collaboration on the book.
So the book originally was going to be a little bit different than what it ended up. It evolved over time, didn't it, Gene?
Yes, it evolved from a book with lots of pictures and a little description of the weavers to a book with a lot of history, a lot of information about the weavers, and of course a lot of pictures of the baskets, plus an accumulation of pictures of the weavers back in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, holding the very baskets we were able to track down and take color images of.
So I think by way of methodology, and what is a bit interesting and unusual about this is you performed original research to get some of the details of the lives of the native artisans. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
How did you go about that?
Well, luckily, I had a lot of experience traveling because of Intel. I was, all over the country a lot of times. I was able to go to the various museums. So I visited the museums to actually see the baskets, and I visited the tribes because I had a lot of experience dealing with the Pueblo Indians on the pottery, so I knew how to, sort of relate to the weavers. So I would meet with the descendants of the weavers. I would meet with the cultural centers. I would meet with the anthropologists at the museums, and we would talk about how all this stuff came about. And of course, there's a lot of, really brilliant scholars that work on this. And so I would consult with them just to make sure that the details were straight.
Didn't you also retain someone to do some work on census data?
Well, we originally started off with a person that was going to help on the book, that had helped Wade on his book on minerals. And he did a lot of work on the census data because there's a lot of conflict since the written records of many of these people is not quite as clear as it is with pottery. Usually on a piece of pottery, dating from the 1890s on, they're signed. So you can say this was made by Nampeo, or this was made by Maria Martinez, or whoever. The baskets are not signed. And the names of the tribes were sometimes misspelled. So you go back to these records, you'd find the same person with the name spelled in 5 different ways. And so it was a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what you're saying is that the authorship on the baskets is often not unambiguous. In other words, we're sometimes not certain of who fashioned a particular basket. Is that correct?
Yes and no.
Okay.
A couple of the weavers, for example, Datsul Ali and Louise Kaiser, she had an agent that cataloged every one of the baskets that she made with an LK designation for Louisa Kaiser. So in those cases, you could be absolutely sure that she made them. Second of all, we were able to track down authentic pictures. There were a lot of photographers going around taking pictures of many of the Indian tribes. So we were able to accumulate a large number of pictures of weavers, often with the baskets. And when you have a picture of the weaver with the basket, you can be fairly well certain that that is the weaver that created the basket.
Yes.
But other than that, there is a certain degree of ambiguity. And then you have experts that look at the style, the weaving style, the number of stitches, the color, the shape of the basket, and all these other artifacts to identify the probable weaver with a pretty high degree of certainty.
Yeah, I think I understand. Now, Louisa Kaiser, she's one of the most famous basket weavers in the world. I think the anthropologist and even the self-identification is called, isn't it Datsolali?
Datsolali is, yes, the name that's given to her.
Yes.
Her Indian name was Dabuda, then her Christian name was Louisa Kaiser, and then she was known as Datsolali.
Now, she had a rather unique relationship, and an uncommon one, where she actually had a patron, did she? A person that helped her live, and compensated her for her beautiful baskets. Who was that patron?
Abe Cohen and his wife, Amy Cohen. It wasn't an uncommon, it was not common, but not uncommon for there to be sponsored. In the case of the Cohens, they had an emporium in Arizona, and not in Arizona, Nevada.
It was at Lake Tahoe. Yeah, it was in Nevada.
Yeah, in Nevada. They had an emporium, and they started to put her baskets for sale, but they saw the quality of them, and they could sort of foresee the future of what was happening. So she was sort of making baskets for them. They cataloged them, and they would sell them through their emporium. And then she eventually sold them in other places as well.
Well, okay, that's our first segment. We're at least beginning to scratch the surface of this remarkable tome. And on the flip-flop, we're going to go next deeper into the methods and the content and the character of this remarkable volume.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ROCKART. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
Welcome back to your Rock Art Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the founder and president of the California Rock Art Foundation. And we have as our guest scholar Gene Meieran, one of the two authors of a remarkable volume on California Indian basketry that was fashioned during the fluorescence, during a period of time where they made the most exquisite masterpiece baskets that provided imagery and beauty and style in a way that has been unparalleled in the history of the world. Gene, we were talking about sort of the way this all came to be, and then about some of the unusual idiosyncrasies of trying to deal with the provenance, the origin, the associations of the baskets. I think one of the things that this book does that other books have not done is really showcase the individual artisans, talk about their background, and then depict them with their baskets. Is this common or not?
That's a hard question to answer, Alan. There are some books about an individual that go into exquisite detail. These are actually scholarly books that are, about a particular individual, such as Dotzalali or Kitty Johnson or something, that really discuss in great detail a lot of stuff that we cover very superficially. What we try to do is to relate the sort of the background of the person and some of the incidents that may have occurred in their lives that have influenced how they design their baskets.
So we're talking about contextualizing the history, the concept, the culture, the cosmology, and interfingering that into the nature of the creation of these remarkable one-of-a-kind baskets. Is that right?
Yes. I can give you a couple of very simple examples. One of them would be Sarah Mayo, who is a Washoe. And I want to say, we talk about California Indian basketry, but the Washoe tribe, which is where Dotzalali was from, also is in western Nevada. So it's not just California. The boundary really doesn't make too much difference. So it's the Lake Tahoe area that had a lot of these creative weavers. But Sarah Mayo made a basket which has disappeared in history. It's called the President's Basket. And she made this for President Woodrow Wilson as a gift to him. And I think it was her husband that carried the basket to Washington, was presented, and has since disappeared. No one knows where the basket is, but it had all kinds of depictions that were relevant to the sort of the merging of the Indian nations with the United States portions, the sort of the white man version of that. So, and this basket had a lot of, historic symbols on it that were the topics of a lot of the baskets. And this presidential basket, unfortunately, has disappeared.
So when we're talking about first of all, the period, I think we have to explain to our audience, this was a remarkable period of time. This was a time where we have a meeting of the cultures, the Euro-American, the American people, and the native people, where they still remembered and were actually using native style, native culture, native cosmology, native religion. But they found a niche where native people, mostly women, I believe, were able to fashion baskets and earn as much money or more than they would have in any other form of occupation or employment. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I think so. Again, the women were making a lot of the baskets, and they were using, native plants from around their areas. And the women that were the greatest of the basket weavers were able to find the finest of the reeds and the willows and all the different plants that they used to make the baskets, and combine that with an incredible technical skill, which is a thing I, as a scientist and a technologist, appreciate, is the fact that they were to put these things together and weave these intricate, not only in the patterns of the weaving, but the patterns of the patterns themselves with the different colors and the different shapes into an incredible geometric designs, geometric as well as pictorial designs, hummingbirds and other kinds of birds and animals and people and buildings and all that. And so what they did, because of the tourism trade that was coming through on the railroads that were now being built into areas that had hitherto been inaccessible, all of a sudden you started getting the mixture of incoming tourists with money wanting to deal with things that they would purchase from the Native Americans able to get the utilitarian utensils that they needed made somewhere else out of aluminum or copper or what have you, and they could just buy these things, and they turned their attention to making the baskets, and yes, they made a much better living as a result of this.
So we have a meeting of the two cultures. We also have a marketing of a new kind of basket, but one that employed the symbols, the designs, the natural materials of the former expression of baskets, and sometimes in new forms, sometimes in new ways, but at a level and sophistication and complexity never before and probably almost never again completed in these masterpiece baskets. Correct?
Yes, I would take a little bit of exception to one thing, and that is I was visiting when I was trying to find certain baskets that we wanted to take pictures of, went to several dealers, and at one dealer's house, I saw some baskets that were remarkably similar to baskets that were dating from the 1900s and the 1940s. So there are some current weavers, usually descendants of the older weavers, that are able to pretty well replicate the artistry, both the technique of fine weaving as well as the neat patterns that they put together. So there seems to be a resurgence of some of this basketry at this time. But again, if you just go back, it's like saying people can painting that's sort of like Rembrandt if they want, or other painters, they can paint them now and it looks very much like those painters. That is happening now. So I don't think that the art has totally disappeared and maybe making a resurgence.
I think you're right. And I think to do justice to this and to inform our listeners, there is an organization called the California Indian Basket Weavers Association. And there are some remarkable artisans that, as you say, can replicate the sophistication, complexity, and beauty of these older baskets. But of course, they're exceptional. And yes, they're artisans of the first caliber. I guess what happened culturally, as I understand, was there was a wave of interest in California Indians in general, and a wave, this sort of a basketry craze that took off. I guess people had particular rooms in their homes that was their Native American or Indian rooms, or that were decorated with baskets. And I guess you have some of those examples in your book, but it was something that was popularized and of great in fashion or in vogue at this time. Am I at all correct?
Yes, you are. Several of them. One of the problems was, though, that the fine art dealers who dealt in paintings of Rembrandt and sculptures of Rodin and pictures of paintings by Van Gogh and all that, they sort of looked down on the basket weaving as a craft. And so they would look at the weavers as being great craftsmen, but not particularly great artists. And I think that perception was just entirely wrong. I think that the baskets, like the pottery, the ceramic pottery that my wife collects from the Pueblos, they are true fine art forms with as much pedigree for fine art as these other things like a Rembrandt painting or a Rubens or whatever.
So there was a bit of prejudice or sort of a snootiness or some sort of a affluence that went down. Has that gone by the by? Has people finally begun to recognize the value and merit and aesthetic sort of appreciation of baskets?
If you're asking me if it's at 100%, no. Is it at 80%? No. Is it at 50%? Probably not. Is it approaching 50%? Possibly, because there are some very wonderful fine art museums that now include these types of objects in them. But not all of them do. So there is still some residual feeling that it's really, it's a very good craft and not a very great art.
So are there any experiences you had or what you need to share with the readers or the individuals that are going to buy this book that you give them sort of an insight or some sort of a deep reflection on what it's like to build and create a volume like this, and give them some metrics as well. Tell them about this book, because it's, first of all, it's huge, and it's also unbelievably beautifully relished in these drop-dead gorgeous photographs that are enormous. There's some firsts with this book, aren't there?
I suppose there are some firsts of a discovery kind. As an example, co-author Wayne Thompson owns a wonderful basket by a lady named Lucinda Hancock. And it's a very large vase-shaped form. Oh, it's about, imagine, say 20, 22 inches high and maybe 15 inches in diameter. A beautiful thing with a lot of pictorial things on it. And there were 6 known baskets. He had one, but it wasn't the one in all the very famous photographs of Lucinda Hancock showing her weaving this particular basket. So he found out where that basket was, or we found out where the basket was. I went to the museum and we arranged for an exchange for his Lucinda Hancock basket for that particular basket, along with some other things. And so we had the basket with the photographs of Lucinda Hancock making the basket.
That's amazing.
And then we had, all the other collectors that had the other 5 of the Lucinda Hancock similar oils. We found those and we had pictures of those, and we were getting the book together, and we had it all laid out, and we had the pictures in the right order. And then Wayne calls me one day and says he found the 7th basket, that a collector had a basket for many years, had never been photographed, but it was one of Lucinda Hancock's baskets. So I think we were the first to bring out this 7th of the Lucinda Hancock large oils it's in the book.
I want to say something about the book because, of course, as I've said in the earlier segment, I was honored and blessed to be its editor. And having produced another volume on an indigenous culture relating to the subject of this basket, what I found was one of the more valuable elements is that this volume and these types of volumes, when they depict the artisans and showcase their history, their culture, their knowledge, and their life, the descendants of these artisans feel overwhelmed by emotion in that they recognize that finally, after so many years, their ancestors, their relatives, and their culture is finally being acknowledged as having value. Am I explaining it correctly, Gene?
Yeah, in fact, we also, Wayne and I, feel the same way as they may feel. So, for example, the book has a number of masterpiece weavers where we know who they are, and we know with fair degree of certainty that the baskets that are depicted under their name are baskets that they were responsible for weaving. But at the same time, there were a number of baskets that are equally beautiful where we have no idea who made them. So we have a section of the book where we've shown a whole bunch of pictures of baskets that are beautiful, equally masterpiece baskets, but we haven't the foggiest idea who made them. We can possibly tell the tribe, but we certainly cannot tell the weaver. By the same token, we also have another section where we have pictures of weavers where we have no names. The photographer went to the tribe, took a whole bunch of pictures, and they say, unidentified weaver. So we included in the book a whole bunch of pictures of weavers that are unidentified, with the hope that perhaps sometime in the not too distant future, people will be able to put a name with a face and bring these people out of obscurity into the light of being identified as a masterpiece weaver with a name.
Absolutely. Yeah, I see that as tremendously valuable. Just some interesting metrics. Before European contact in California, there were 300,000 Native people living within the geopolitical boundaries of the great state, the Golden State of California, and they spoke 90 languages. So we had a very, very complex landscape, both linguistically and culturally. And I think that the book that you and Wayne put together certainly testifies to some of that diversity in terms of the ethnic and linguistic groups that are represented, both from the northern, central, and southern parts of California and into western Nevada. We'll try to put a bow on it and try to tell some rather interesting stories. See you on the flip-flop.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
Welcome back to the final segment of your Rock Art podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network. Here's your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, interviewing Gene Meieran. He's a remarkable man, an author, someone who's got a background in high technology, and someone who spent the last decade putting together an incredible volume on masterpiece California Indian basketry. And I think in this last segment, we're going to try to delve into the people behind the baskets. Gene, you said you may have some reflections about meeting some of the descendants of the weavers.
Yeah, it's hard because what you try and do is trace through various genealogical patterns to see if you can come up with some of the ancestors and the descendants of the people whose ancestors were the famous basket weavers. And unfortunately, again, the time frame for the baskets that we have in the book is roughly 1895, 1900 to about 1940. But remember, during the 1920s, we had this terrible flu epidemic, and a lot of people died at that time. A lot of the Indians, they were susceptible to the disease, so they died, their husband died, their children died. So a lot of times there just simply are no ancestors with whom to talk. But we were able to trace down some of them, and it's an interesting thing because a lot of them are, living in fairly distant places. They don't have computers, they don't have internet and all that. And somehow I would be able to trace a telephone number, and I'd call them on the line, and it was a very, very wary of getting a funny phone call. And they would say, who are you? Why are you calling? And I would say, we're writing this book, and I know a little bit about your ancestor. We want to include them in the book. As soon as you started talking in those terms, they would lighten up and be willing to share with you. And they would share pictures that they had, which is where we got some of the neat pictures that are in the book that were unpublished. We got them from the people that were the descendants, and they just had it in these old books that they had around the house. And on occasion, they would have some of the baskets that we could take. And I could tell you one of them, for example, was Lena Dick. We knew about her because she was a very famous weaver. And there had been other books written about her. And in one of the books is a very famous picture of her standing in front of an automobile. I don't know, I guess it's 1925, 1930, something like that. 1935, she's standing in front of it. And it's this old black and white picture. And so after about a year and a half of trying to trace her down, I found out that there was actually a color photograph, an old color photograph, and I met the granddaughter of Lena Dick near Reno, and she gave me access to the photograph along with some other pictures that had not been published of her, and just got to talking about the influence, not necessarily that the person directly had, because she was a little girl when her grandmother was doing the weaving. But grandmother passed away at an age when the granddaughter was fairly small. And therefore, it's secondary influence. But nonetheless, the fact that here's this woman who is famous, that was their descendant, their ancestor, would just bring out all kinds of interesting things, and then they would offer me a dinner and the Indian food, and all kinds of neat things would happen.
That's wonderful. It really is. I guess one of the things that was of great interest to me was this Victorville phenomenon they talk about. I happen to have had the experience of meeting or visiting the Victorville village itself that exists at the Victorville Narrows in California. And I actually know and have connected with descendants and relationships, knowledgeable people who are insiders or distantly related to the people who fashioned those remarkable baskets. And we do include those in the book. In this village in the 1930s and even earlier, there were a number of native people living as natives in wickiup brush houses. And they, in fact, were basket weavers representing, a whole plethora of different Indian groups, Serrano, Kawayasu, Chimawave. They were all there, all intermingled, living in that particular place. And a number of the basket weavers produced extraordinary baskets, both visually stunning as well as some innovative styles. And you remember this, don't you, Gene?
Well, that part of the basket weaving was not my specialty. I do know that there were a lot of influences, intertribal influences, where, as an example, there's a basket by Mary Benson, who's a Pomo, that if you look at the basket, you would swear that this is a Datsulali basket. I mean, it's That's a Lolly style, and it is clearly an influence of the Washoe that they had over into the Pomo, which is, it's, quite a distance away.
Sure.
And it's funny because I would see the same thing in the pottery from the Pueblos, where a Zia pot and a Zuni pot, you would not be able to tell because a Zuni person would marry another person from the Zia, or a Zia would marry somebody from the Hopi or the Navajo, and you would find that these influences crossed over the tribal lines and influenced how the other tribes did their work.
Well, in California, something that I've learned just from, 30, 40, 50 years of study, we were talking about a polyglot of cultures. It was very common that we had multi-ethnic villages and that Indians from one group would speak several different languages, minimally 3 or 4 different languages because of the differences in the Indians. And they would in turn borrow cultural items and cultural lifeways, as you're well aware, and religious traditions and elements would move from culture to culture. There is certainly the rattlesnake design depicted in baskets, and these are necked jars that exist amongst the groups in the Central Valley called yokuts. And those neck jars were actually used traditionally in what they call the rattlesnake ceremony, where they actually had rattlesnakes in those baskets and performed various ceremonial elements to protect them from rattlesnake bites. Also, the rattlesnake design itself, those diamonds or those triangles are represented on the rattlesnake's body, and those were the design elements that appear in the baskets themselves. And in the native languages, they call them rattlesnake. That's the rattlesnake design. The Kauai-Sioux Indians, the Southern Paiutes in that area, have that name. In fact, another type of design is called the kogo, or the gopher snake basket, and that looks like the design on the gopher snake themselves. Now, besides that, there's all of these friendship baskets, those big circular baskets that have men and women connected with hands in a big circle. And those were rather common dances, religious and ceremonial dances, which are called the round dance. And these were times where people got together, both one tribe and another time. And at those times, they were times of joy, they were times of connection, and times of also meeting other people and establishing relationships and getting spouses. So those are the images on the baskets themselves are sometimes just for design and for beauty and for artistry, but other times have rather significant meaning and depth to the native people in terms of their perception and their cosmology.
I could see the same thing is true of something I know a little more about in that sense, and that is on the pottery. We were very, very friendly with a number of Hopi potters. We would go up to the villages of Second Mesa and so forth every year, and we would participate during Christmas time in their ceremonies. You'd see the mixture between the Catholic ceremony and the Indian portion of the ceremony, where the two would be mixed. But we would, in the Hopi in particular, we had a number of Hopi pots, and these are, quote, commercial in the sense they were made by artists to sell. But then you would find a pot that they would not sell that looked precisely alike the one that we would buy, but it was one of their holy pots and would have a particular symbolism on it that would make it a special pot to them, which they would use for their internal ceremonies, and it was something they would simply not part with. It was not something I could easily see, but I could certainly understand.
So if we're going to sign off on something that it's called syncretic religions that merge the various cultures and religions of various people, there is a basket that's very famous. It's called the Apostolic Basket. It sits in Meloe Museum. It was done by a Kauai-Sioux native found in the Paiute Mountains. And that basket was showcased on the bema where the priest would be in the San Fernando Valley mission. And on that basket was the apostles of Christ, and then the gentleman who turned him in. And he was there a little bit apart from the 12 apostles. So they called it the apostolic basket. So there is meaning and there's significance to the imagery. And sometimes the designs were actually named, and baskets had various themes. Sometimes there was bats, sometimes thunderbirds, which of course was the rain bird and one that brought the needed lightning and the celestial blessings that allowed for growth and renewal. And so I think sometimes the subject matter of the baskets had to do with life. I think we see birds and animals and trees and an emphasis on the vitality and continuation of tradition.
Yeah, well, let me add one word about the basket you were just talking about it's at the Hearst Museum. I did not know about that basket. You know, you hear these names and you hear about a basket somewhere, and I may have heard about it, but anyway, I was at the museum going through other things, looking for particular baskets that were in pictures that we had of some of the weavers. And as I was going out, I looked down and I saw this wonderful basket in a sort of a sideways case that was sort of hidden. And it was this apostolic basket. And so I stopped and I went back to the museum curator. I said, what? And then she said, oh, well, that is that special basket. So we actually have a picture of that basket in the book. And it is, as you say, a wonderful basket with a remarkable history. There's actually a book written about that particular basket.
Amazing. Well, it seems like we're sort of ending towards the tail end of this third and final segment. Gene, what could you tell us about this book that would entice our readers to learn more about it and even purchase copies? And how can they go about getting a copy of this book?
The book is being published by a company called Sunbelt in Southern California. And there's going to be several different kinds of versions of the book. There'll be a soft cover version, which has a certain price. I don't determine the price, really. There's a hardcover version, which is obviously more expensive. And there'll be a special deluxe version for people who want special box and for gifts or whatever. But the Sunbelt Publishing will be able to tell you, I can only encourage everyone to buy as many books as you can possibly buy.
That's not a marketing ploy, is it?
No, it's just a statement of fact. You know, it took Wayne and I 10 years, and he was going through a very difficult time, the first 3 or 4 years of putting the book together. So it was a very difficult book. And as we would get deeper into it, we would hear more about the weavers. We got to include this weaver because she's clearly a masterpiece. And then we'd have to include this basket and that basket because they were, so it would just go on. And finally, when I was in Intel, you had the same kind of a thing. You could make this nice computer chip, and somebody would always have something that say, we can do this, and that on. And you have what's called creeping elegance, which means that there's never an end. So finally, we had to say, it's enough. This is the end. We have the pictures, and the book is done.
Well, God bless you for participating in this remarkable adventure. It's been an honor to chat with you, Gene, in this open forum. The book is remarkable. It profiles, I think, almost 100 weavers. I think there was 65.
45 in great detail, another 20 in less detail, and then the whole section on unidentified weavers where we hope somebody can say who they are.
There's about 650 black and white and color photographs in this book. And many of them are in gorgeous color. And the size of these images give you a sense of the beauty and scale of these baskets. So it really is a treat for the eyes and the soul to sort of engage in this project. And I've been honored and blessed to be part of it. Gene, it's been wonderful. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this podcast.
Well, it was great working with you, Alan.
Thank you. I think we'll sign off and see you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. You can find this podcast on the educational podcast app Lyceum, Lyceum, and wherever you find podcasts. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.